Look around. You vote, you post, you protest. But behind the noise, who really holds power? And more importantly, who is protected from consequence? There's something we've forgotten, something that kept one of history's greatest minds awake at night. Aristotle feared oligarchy more than tyranny because tyrants are obvious. They announce themselves, they demand worship, they rule through terror. But oligarchs, they hide behind institutions, laws, brands, and charities. They smile while they strangle, and we protect them. The true friend of the people should see that the people do not become too poor, Aristotle wrote in his Politics. His fear wasn't wealth itself. It was inequality without virtue, power concentrated in hands that never get dirty, decisions made by those who never face consequences. What did he see that we've chosen to forget? What warning did he leave us, buried beneath centuries of comfortable lies about democracy and freedom? Let's go back to the warning we forgot, to the mirror we're afraid to look into. Most people think government is simple: democracy versus dictatorship, freedom versus tyranny. But Aristotle saw something far more sophisticated and far more terrifying. He saw government as a living organism that rots from within, following predictable patterns of decay. His map wasn't linear, it was cyclical. Monarchy decays into tyranny when kings stop serving their people. Aristocracy corrupts into oligarchy when merit gives way to greed. Constitutional government collapses into mob rule when emotion replaces reason. Every form of government has a deviant form, he observed, when the rulers rule for themselves rather than for the common good. But here's where it gets disturbing. Aristotle believed oligarchy was the most dangerous corruption of all. Not because oligarchs are crueler than tyrants, but because they're invisible. They don't seize power, they purchase it. They don't destroy institutions, they hollow them out and wear them like masks. They don't oppress people, they convince people to oppress themselves. Now, I'm not saying our democratic institutions have accomplished nothing. We've won real rights through centuries of struggle. Civil rights, labour protections, environmental standards. These victories matter. But here's what's chilling. Many of these hard-won protections are being systematically eroded by the very wealth concentration Aristotle warned about. Let me give you a concrete example. Boeing rushed the 737 MAX into production, prioritizing profit over safety. The result? 2 fatal crashes, 300. When a corporation becomes so powerful, it doesn't just bend the rules, it writes them. It regulates itself, silences accountability, and walks away richer while the public pays the price. Or consider pharmaceutical companies like Purdue Pharma. They knew opioids were addictive, hid the evidence, and fueled an epidemic that killed over 400,000 Americans. The Sackler family extracted billions in profits. When finally caught, they paid fines that were a fraction of their wealth and faced no jail time. Meanwhile, people struggling with addiction face imprisonment and social stigma. The system protects those who create harm while punishing those who suffer from it. Oligarchy isn't just rule by the rich, it's rule by those who use wealth to systematically exclude others from power while maintaining the illusion of participation. The genius of modern oligarchy is that it feels voluntary. We think we're choosing our leaders, our jobs, our futures, but the options were predetermined by those with the resources to shape the menu. It is more proper that law should govern than any one of the citizens, Aristotle insisted. Law should be blind, impartial, universal. But what happens when the law becomes something only the wealthy can afford to understand, to navigate, to escape? You get a system where justice isn't blind, it's for sale. Human psychology. Now, here's where it gets truly unsettling, where human psychology becomes our greatest weakness. Why do we protect the very people who exploit us? Why do we defend a system that treats us as disposable? Why do we rage against those below us while worshipping those above us? Science has actually studied this. Psychologists John and Masarin Banagi discovered something disturbing in their research on system justification theory. They found that people have a psychological need to defend the status quo, even when it hurts them. In one experiment, they showed that people living in poverty were more likely to justify wealth inequality than middle-class people. The very people being crushed by the system defended it most strongly. Why? Because admitting the system is rigged means admitting you're trapped, and that's too painful to accept. Our brain's desperate need to believe that the world is fundamentally fair and orderly means that when faced with obvious injustice, we don't revolt. We rationalize. We create stories that make the unbearable bearable. Maybe they worked harder. Maybe they're just smarter. Maybe I'll be rich too someday. It's just how the world works. We trade our righteous anger for a fantasy of eventual inclusion. We accept crumbs today for the promise of cake tomorrow. A cake that will never come. And oligarchs understand this psychology perfectly. They don't just extract our wealth, they capture our imagination. They sell us the American dream while systematically destroying the most brilliant part. They've convinced us that questioning the system makes us losers, complainers, socialists, that accepting exploitation is somehow mature, realistic, patriotic. But there's something even more insidious at work. The oligarchs have mastered the ancient art of division. Tyrants preserve themselves by sowing discord among the people, Aristotle observed. But oligarchs are more sophisticated than tyrants. They don't need obvious oppression. They just need strategic division. Here's how this works in practice. Amazon spent $4.3 million on anti-union consultants to stop workers from organizing in Alabama. But what did the news focus on? Whether the workers were being manipulated by outside agitators. Meanwhile, Jeff Bezos made $13 billion during the pandemic, while his workers couldn't afford to take sick days. But somehow, the conversation became about whether workers deserved $15 an hour, not why the richest man on earth was fighting so hard to keep his employees poor. If the poor are fighting each other over race, religion, or immigration status, they'll never unite against economic exploitation. If the middle class fears the poor more than they fear the rich, they'll side with the oligarchs for protection. If workers compete against each other instead of organizing together, wages stay low and profits stay high. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's strategy as old as civilization. Look at our media landscape. Look at our political discourse. How much time do we spend fighting each other over cultural issues while economic inequality reaches historical extremes? How often are we debating who deserves basic dignity while billionaires pay lower tax rates than teachers? Here's something that would have terrified Aristotle: the systematic destruction of the middle class. The best political community is formed by citizens of the middle class, he wrote. Why? Because the middle class has skin in the game. They're not desperate enough to be bought, not wealthy enough to be corrupted, and numerous enough to check both extremes. A stable society needs people who have enough to survive without desperation, enough to grow without greed, enough to participate in civic life without being owned by anyone. The middle class serves as democracy's immune system, preventing both the chaos of desperate poverty and the corruption of unchecked wealth. But look at the data. Research from the Economic Policy Institute shows that since 1979, productivity has increased 70%, while wages for typical workers have grown only 12%. Studies reveal the top 1% now controls 32% of all wealth, while the bottom 50% owns just 2%. College costs have increased 1,200% since 1980. Medical bills contribute to hundreds of thousands of personal bankruptcies annually, according to various studies. This isn't natural economic evolution, it's engineered extraction. What happens when the middle class collapses into debt and anxiety? When the poor become desperate and angry? When the rich become untouchable and arrogant? You don't get revolution. Revolution requires hope, organization, and shared vision. Instead, you get something far more insidious: learned helplessness, masquerading as democracy. Psychologist Martin Seligman's famous experiments with dogs showed how learned helplessness works. Dogs that couldn't escape electric shocks eventually stopped trying to escape. Even when escape became possible, they just lay there and took it. Sound familiar? How many people do you know who complain about their jobs, their debt, their healthcare costs, but have stopped believing anything can actually change? Modern oligarchy has perfected this illusion. It doesn't need to ban free speech, it just buys the platforms. It doesn't need to rig elections, it just funds all viable candidates. It doesn't need to control information, it just floods the zone with noise. The most effective prison is the one where the inmates don't realize they're locked up.
Virtue collapse.
Aristotle believed the greatest threat to any society wasn't external invasion, it was internal virtue collapse. When citizens stop caring about the common good, when leaders pursue private gain over public service, when wealth becomes the only measure of worth, that's when civilizations die from within. Look at our culture with honest eyes. What do we celebrate? What do we reward? What do we teach our children to aspire to? We worship wealth, regardless of how it's obtained. We celebrate fame, regardless of what it's built on. We admire power, regardless of how it's used. This is exactly what Aristotle feared, a culture where money becomes the measure of merit, where success justifies any method, where winning matters more than how you play the game. We've replaced citizenship with consumerism, community with competition, and service with extraction. And today, the loss of virtue is not just cultural, it's systemic. Social media doesn't just reflect this decay, it accelerates it. Platforms reward outrage over honesty, spectacle over substance, and popularity over principle. They train us to perform instead of think, to react instead of reflect. In a world where the algorithm decides what matters, virtue has no market value, and without virtue, democracy becomes a brand, curated, commodified, and sold back to us as engagement. When virtue dies, democracy dies with it. What remains is just the machinery of consent, manufacturing the appearance of choice. We get to choose between pre-selected options, debate pre-framed questions, and participate in predetermined outcomes. Aristotle's warning was prophetic. Once oligarchs establish themselves, they will never voluntarily relinquish power. They must be contained by structure, not trust, constrained by education, not obedience, checked by organized citizens, not hopeful individuals. Modern politic. Aristotle wasn't advocating for socialism or communist revolution. He wasn't anti-wealth or anti-achievement. He was advocating for balance, what he called polity, constitutional government rooted in civic virtue and broad participation. A system where merit mattered more than money, where laws served the common interest, not special interests, and where power was distributed widely enough to prevent corruption. So what would a modern polity look like? It starts with structural changes that make oligarchy impossible to sustain. First, we need to break the stranglehold of money on politics. That means constitutional amendments to overturn Citizens United, public financing of campaigns, and complete transparency in political donations. When dark money can pour unlimited resources into elections, democracy becomes an
virtue collapse.
Aristotle believed the greatest threat to any society wasn't external invasion, it was internal virtue collapse. When citizens stop caring about the common good, when leaders pursue private gain over public service, when wealth becomes the only measure of worth, that's when civilizations die from within. Look at our culture with honest eyes. What do we celebrate? What do we reward? What do we teach our children to aspire to? We worship wealth, regardless of how it's obtained. We celebrate fame, regardless of what it's built on. We admire power, regardless of how it's used. This is exactly what Aristotle feared, a culture where money becomes the measure of merit, where success justifies any method, where winning matters more than how you play the game. We've replaced citizenship with consumerism, community with competition, and service with extraction. And today, the loss of virtue is not just cultural, it's systemic. Social media doesn't just reflect this decay, it accelerates it. Platforms reward outrage over honesty, spectacle over substance, and popularity over principle. They train us to perform instead of think, to react instead of reflect. In a world where the algorithm decides what matters, virtue has no market value, and without virtue, democracy becomes a brand, curated, commodified, and sold back to us as engagement. When virtue dies, democracy dies with it. What remains is just the machinery of consent, manufacturing the appearance of choice. We get to choose between pre-selected options, debate pre-framed questions, and participate in predetermined outcomes. Aristotle's warning was prophetic. Once oligarchs establish themselves, they will never voluntarily relinquish power. They must be contained by structure, not trust, constrained by education, not obedience, checked by organized citizens, not hopeful individuals. Modern politic. Aristotle wasn't advocating for socialism or communist revolution. He wasn't anti-wealth or anti-achievement. He was advocating for balance, what he called polity, constitutional government rooted in civic virtue and broad participation. A system where merit mattered more than money, where laws served the common interest, not special interests, and where power was distributed widely enough to prevent corruption. So what would a modern polity look like? It starts with structural changes that make oligarchy impossible to sustain. First, we need to break the stranglehold of money on politics. That means constitutional amendments to overturn Citizens United, public financing of campaigns, and complete transparency in political donations. When dark money can pour unlimited resources into elections, democracy becomes an but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. A small group accumulating power at the expense of everyone else, then using that power to ensure their position becomes permanent. But here's what gives me hope. Awareness can slow the cycle. Education can delay corruption. Structure can check power. Citizens can choose virtue over comfort, long-term thinking over short-term gain, common good over private benefit. Awakening, so here we are, 2,400 years after Aristotle's warning, staring into the same mirror he held up to his world. And what do we see? We see a handful of individuals with more wealth than entire nations. We see corporations that write the laws that govern them. We see basic necessities transformed into luxury commodities. We see democracy reduced to choosing between pre-selected options every few years, while real power operates in boardrooms and country clubs. But we also see something Aristotle would recognize: the possibility of awakening. You're still here, you're still listening, you're still thinking. That means something in you refuses to accept that this is just how things have to be. The path forward isn't about tearing everything down. It's about building something better. It starts with individual awareness, but it requires collective action. It means supporting organizations, fighting for campaign finance reform, antitrust enforcement, and worker rights. It means engaging in local politics where your voice still matters. It means educating yourself on these issues and educating others. Most importantly, it means refusing to accept that oligarchy is natural or inevitable. It means remembering that every right we have was won by people who refused to accept the status quo. It means understanding that democracy isn't a spectator sport, it's a participation requirement. Aristotle would recognize our world immediately, but he wouldn't call it democracy. He'd call it exactly what it is: oligarchy with democratic characteristics, rule by the few, disguised as rule by the many. The question that should haunt you is this: now that you see it, what are you going to do about it? Because here's what Aristotle understood that we've forgotten. Freedom isn't a gift, it's a practice. Democracy isn't a system, it's a commitment. Justice isn't a law, it's a choice we make every day. And if this made something click for you, if it shook something loose, then chances are someone else in your life needs to hear it too. Maybe it's a friend who's struggling to make sense of the world, someone who feels powerless, frustrated, or quietly angry. Don't let them feel alone in that. Share this with them, not because it has all the answers, but because sometimes the first step toward change is knowing you're not crazy for seeing what you see. The mirror is in your hands now. What do you see when you look around with these new eyes? And more importantly, what are you willing to do about what you see?